Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing NATO involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. NATO has announced that it's expanding its training mission. According to Stoltenberg, Jan Stoltenberg, this is a request of the Iraqi government itself. So the NATO training mission will now expand from 500 to around 4,000 personnel, while the defense ministries for the member states of NATO have, at this point in time, held off on making a final decision on their 9,600-strong mission, which is in Afghanistan. We know, of course, that the Afghanistan Study Group, which was formed by the U.S. Congress, has advised Joe Biden not to meet the May 1st deadline, as set out between the deal that the U.S. and the Taliban had signed under Donald Trump to withdraw completely from that country. However, there is, of course, debate about that as well, and the risk that that may very well pose to the Afghanistan peace process. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. Our guests are all joining us from Ontario, Canada today. We're joined now by Dr. Joel Sokolsky, who is a professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada. He's joining us today from Kingston. Joining us this morning from London is Dr. Erika Simpson, who is an associate professor of international relations at Western University. She's also the president of the Canadian Peace Research Association. And joining us from Kitchener is Dr. Alistair Edgar, who is an associate professor of political science at Belgium School of International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University. Alistair, Erika, and Joel, thank you to all three of you for your time this morning. Joel, let me start with you. Let's start with Iraq, if we may. Jan Stoltenberg said that this expansion of this mission is being carried out with a full respect for Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity. How important is it at this time for NATO to be expanding its presence in Iraq?
Well, I think it's important not simply because of the need for training in Iraq, but I think at the beginning of the Biden administration, the United States is looking for a signal that it's going to reciprocate President Biden's reaffirmation of the importance of NATO for the United States. The issues of burden sharing that President Trump awkwardly brought up are still there. And I think this is important for the alliance to signal that it is pleased the United States is going to re-engage and is going to indicate that it's going to make a commitment to an ongoing mission and increase it. So at this time, I think it's important for the alliance to make this gesture. Apart from the fact that I think it's something the alliance can do, it's something that training mission seems to be more acceptable to the public than other missions. If you can put this together, I think it'll help U.S.-NATO relations.
Erika, when it comes to the Iraq context, there is this huge elephant in the room, right? And that is, of course, about what's happened between the U.S. And Iran on Iraqi soil. And I'm speaking specifically, of course, about the assassination of Soleimani and then the retaliation, the Iranian retaliation, the ongoing, if we're completely honest, proxy war between the two on Iraqi soil. I mean, do you think that even just as a training mission, which of course I imagine the U.S. will obviously be involved in as an important NATO member, that this is smart and that this will probably also keep those tensions going?
Well, the training mission was established back in 2004. So why I suppose that your viewers are concerned is because it's been expanded so significantly yesterday and this last week by NATO defense ministers. So from 500 personnel to over 4,000, but in progressive incremental stages. So we don't know how long that will take. Yes, I share your concern about Iran. And also I wanted to congratulate your viewers and your country for your Prime Minister Khan's announcement that Pakistan will foreseeably follow a strategy of no first use regarding nuclear weapons. So that is an important breakthrough in world politics that people here in Canada are observing with great interest. So I think it's really important to reduce the tensions, and in the wake of the new Biden administration after 4 rocky years with Donald Trump, that we hail every kind of peaceful movement. And so what you're doing in Pakistan is just so key. And I really wanted to congratulate you.
All right, Alistair, let's go back, if we may, to Iraq. What are your thoughts about the expansion of this mission and why it is that even after all these years of involvement in Iraq, that the Iraqi forces and establishment are not at a point where they are independent enough to be able to handle their own domestic security issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, and by the way, hello to Erika and Joel, good colleagues of mine. The training mission itself, I'm sure you know, Waqar, there's a lot of additional logistics that are needed, especially things like transportation, helicopter transportation. There's a lot of training at the strategic level, at the operational level as well. And I think if one puts it into perspective, 20 years is a long time, or 17 years is a long time, but not very long to be training up a full national military. So to get from post-invasion and the destruction that went with that to what is trying to be a full-scale national military able to deal with a range of threats from groups like ISIS is a long haul. You certainly hope that Western troops will be out of there in a few years, but 20 years is a really short time span to try to draw up an entire military, to provide it with all of the training facilities, all of the intelligence, the command and control capabilities, as well as the on-the-ground operational capacity that is needed for a country the size of Iraq.
Joel, I wanted to bring in Afghanistan into the conversation too, just to the extent that, perception-wise, right, when we have NATO forces either involved still in Iraq, even just in training mission, or in Afghanistan as a support mission, that the perception, be it, for those who support the Taliban and or other groups within Iraq who are admittedly quite anti-U.S. and anti-U.S. involvement, or Western involvement, if I may term it that way more generally, this provides fodder for them, doesn't it? So does this sometimes in certain ways almost become counterproductive?
Well, in both places, the governments there have asked for this assistance. The alternative is not to give it and to weaken the governments, which runs the risk of even more uncertainty and instability. So there's always a risk. The advantage here of, particularly in Iraq, with the NATO mission, and if NATO decides to maintain its forces in Afghanistan, along with if the U.S. forces do, it presents the region with a more or less unified Western response. So it can't divide the United States from its allies, and it indicates that going forward in any negotiations, the United States has the backing and support of its allies, and I think that's important. If it manages to drive a wedge between the U.S. and its key NATO allies, I don't think that's good for the regions or for the prospect of peace and stability there. So in both cases, you run the risk of adverse reaction, but the opposite, a disunited West approaching both Iraq and Afghanistan, I think is much worse.
If I may play devil's advocate for a moment, Erika, if we're looking at both the Afghan and Iraqi governing structure, right, and governments in place, there's a lot of criticism of both of the above, right? And we can talk about corruption, of course, within their ranks quite significantly, but in Iraq as well, we can talk about, the sectarian, for example, nature and the way it's broken down and power is shared. And, that's something that's also an issue in Lebanon, for example. But to support such a governing structure where there have been protests, especially in Iraq, for example, against that very structure. Again, I'm just trying to understand the logic of then standing so strongly by these very imperfect systems.
Well, I've been on record since 2006 to be opposed to our initial involvement in Afghanistan, so I might not be the right person to comment on why we should stay there. I do think, and I will speak up strongly for the secular government of Ashraf Ghani, where he is you could argue he's not a democratically elected, but certainly a government that is bent on a secular approach. as opposed to the Taliban, which even at the Doha negotiations has not yet agreed to power sharing. And we have to be very critical of the Taliban's approach to the negotiations. Today, the New York Times is reporting on the numbers of deaths just this February, over 141, and many civilians and so on. So NATO, I want to emphasize, is not just the United States, it's also Germany, which has decided not to withdraw. They were thinking of withdrawing in March, and now they are saying that they will possibly stay. And there's other allies like the Italians. Now, Canada did withdraw. And I want to emphasize, we were there for 14 years, and thousands of Canadians died. So it's not just a U.S.-led operation. I understand that you are concerned about U.S. expansion in the Middle East. I understand that fear and that concern. But I think that it's a training mission in Iraq. It's not a combat-capable force. They're not. It's not that the United States is in there ready to carry out a war. It's training for. It is training for combat capability, but it's training. So just to emphasize the 2 points there, Afghanistan and Iraq, we need to defend the evolution of democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, although it is very, very slow. We've seen that for 4 decades.
Yeah, and I know those are the fair points to bring up. Thank you, Erika. Of course, NATO is not just the U.S. I mean, I don't want to fall into that trap of, as many of us in media do, that NATO is just the U.S. Certainly, there are other very, very important members of that alliance as well, and they each have, their respective influence and interests as well at play in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So, Alistair, if I may bring you into the conversation, then, what do you make of then, if I may for a moment speak specifically about Afghanistan, because there is that entire context, of course, also of the Afghan peace process, will remaining there on the part of the entire NATO force after May 1st be a smart move? I mean, will that hurt the Afghan peace process?
Gosh, that's a hard one, Waqar, because it as Erika mentioned, much of it depends on what the Taliban really intend. I mean, they can use this as an excuse to ramp up the violence that they've been perpetrating, or not. So it's really up to the Taliban. They have not shown that they're willing to decrease attacks in the region. They're not necessarily showing that they're willing to reduce or cut off ties to what the West will call terrorist organizations. So a lot of it is really in their hands. They can use, as I said, they can use this as an excuse to say, we don't believe the West or the Afghan government are negotiating in good faith in Doha, or they can say, okay, we need to demonstrate that we are good partners, and that the West and that the United States can withdraw its troops. So it's an interesting situation. Whatever the West does, really the response will be in the hands of the Taliban.
Joel, what are your thoughts about, remaining in Afghanistan beyond May 1st? There doesn't seem to be a complete win-win situation here for the West, but NATO specifically. But I mean, at the same time, it's not like the Taliban do not have significant enough support in Afghanistan to have quite a bit of sway.
Well, I think you're right. It's not a win-win, and that's the nature of this sort of diplomacy and foreign policy. It's here NATO is being asked to choose between two not palatable alternatives: staying and risking coming under fire from the Taliban, or leaving and abandoning the government, its democratic progress towards democracy, towards gender equality. So it's a risk. But if I come back to that earlier point, is that it would certainly help the U.S. Congress and the United States make a decision to stay if it received, if NATO reaffirmed that it too was going to remain. It works both ways. It's reassurance both ways, and although we have a new administration that's pro-NATO, this is a way of indicating that NATO, beyond percentages of GDP spent on defense, is willing to share the burden. And I think it's risky. I'd also say that the mission in Iraq is risky. I agree with Erika that it's not combat, but still you're sending soldiers into what is a conflict zone. So it's not. It's a very major commitment. But unless we in the West are prepared to see Afghanistan fall back to the Taliban and perhaps become a safe haven for terrorism, this is a decision that has to be made at this time.
Erika, I'll give you the final word before I let the three of you go. How does one then get the majority of people on board? And I'm speaking specifically about the Iraqi and Afghan peoples, right? Because both of the above have suffered from both terrorism and what can arguably be termed as well as, atrocities from the other side as well. And we can talk about Abu Ghraib, for example, in Iraq. And I'm not trying to generalize and put this on all NATO members, but I'm just saying that the perception would be that the West did that, right? In Afghanistan, there are various cases about innocents being killed as quote unquote collateral damage, as we may term it. But I would think that there would be a significant majority that would also still remain suspicious of Western intentions, even if just in non-combat roles?
Yes, I think that we have to recognize that the Afghan people are tired of war and they're sick and tired of fighting. And so when we ask ourselves about the future, I know Dr. Sokolsky was mentioning about the deadlines. The deadline of May 1st will come and go and the NATO allies will stay there. There's no question that they'll continue to stay there. So what is the next deadline? That would be 4 years hence when President Biden and the Democratic administration are running again. Then they need an end game. Then they need some sort of solution to tell the American people that they're staying in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's Afghanistan that's the big issue for the American people because they've spent over $1 trillion and thousands of lives. So they can't just pull out and then say all those sacrifices went anywhere, or went down. It was just totally useless. So the problem is the Afghan people are sick and tired of fighting. The American people are tired of contributing to Afghanistan and to Iraq. And so 4 years from now, that's when the rubber hits the road, as we say here in Canada, because of snow. That's when the decisions will have to show some sort of an end game and some sort of a conclusion to this. But right now, May 1st, I think that deadline's going to come and go, and NATO will still be there for sure in Iraq and for sure in Afghanistan. And it's the Afghan people and the Iraqi people who are on the ground in the districts outside of the cities that are not protected. These are the people that we are all praying for their long-term survival and so on.
Very well. We'll leave that conversation at that, but we sincerely appreciate Drs. Sokolsky, Simpson, and Edgar for taking their time out of their Saturday mornings to speaking to us respectively from Kingston, Ontario, London, Ontario, and Kitchener, Ontario. They were sharing their expertise with us about NATO and its significantly expanded training mission in Iraq, as well as its very likely decision to remain in Afghanistan even beyond the May 1st deadline that was outlined in the U.S. Taliban deal, peace deal, if I may call it that. How will this affect the Afghanistan peace process? How will this affect the situation within Iraq itself? What does it represent for the Iraqi and Afghan peoples? Is there further chaos and death and destruction essentially on the at least near future horizon for both peoples? And how does that then play out into the perception of NATO remaining in both places, in the minds of both peoples as well? Because at the end of the day, remember, it's meant to be about creating safety and security and prosperity for both peoples. It's not meant to just be about involvement in whatever role, be it non-combat as well, in these respective countries. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a joint survey that has been conducted by 3 European advocacy groups. And what they found within the European nations that were surveyed was that the most positive views towards minorities, amongst those most positive views, and we're talking comparably here within these nations, just 29% of English people held positive views, for example, towards Muslims. And we're not just going to talk about Muslims throughout this show, because there are, of course, various other ethnicities and minority groups across Europe which are also not seen by and large in a very positive light. 8 countries, as I said, were surveyed. At least a quarter of people in each country have negative views. Again, speaking more about Muslims, with Hungarians, in fact, registering the highest levels of antipathy at about 54%. And this is also, of course, connected to anti-immigrant feelings because of the at least perceived immigrant wave that has been hitting Europe for a number of years now. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further with our esteemed panelists who are joining us from various parts of Europe today. We're now joined by Dr. Joana Deus Pereira, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. She is joining us today from Brussels in Belgium. Joining us today from Brno in the Czech Republic is Dr. Miroslav, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the International Institute of Political Science at FSS Masaryk University. And joining us from Granada in Spain is Dr. Carmen Aguilera-Carnerero, who is a Senior Research Fellow for the Center for Analysis of Radical Right. She's also a researcher with the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University. Carmen, Miroslav, and Joana, thank you to all 3 of you for joining us today here in Scope. Joana, let me start with you. It's no surprise, right, that we have far-right sentiments growing across Europe. How much of a concern, though, is this?
Hello, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I would say this doesn't come as a surprise. Actually, in 2018, the European Council on Foreign Relations had also performed a large survey amongst the EU member states. And unsurprisingly, 26% of the interviewees thought that immigration and Islamic radicals were the biggest threat to Europe today and to the European way of life. So I would say that this narrative, the discourse towards an antagonistic view, not only towards Muslims, but also towards other minorities, have been developing and fueled since the so-called migration wave peak in 2015. But we can never, and this is, of course, it's a cliche, that Europe drastically changed how it looks at Muslims with 9/11 and the subsequent terrorist attacks. Of course, that the so-called migration wave has boosted nationalist and populist parties in Europe, but also a new trend that is also highlighted in this report, that is the loosen civil society movements that are nowadays organizing throughout online platforms that are very threatening to the rise of far-right in Europe.
Miroslav, what are your thoughts about this? I mean, this is a danger to everyone, right? Because, you know, hatred towards one group very easily translates into hatred towards other groups.
Of course, I fully agree, because these far-right movements, they have similar main enemies, and of course they try to also find new enemies in their agenda. So generally, if I may now intermediate the Central European point of view, we can see, for example, the long tradition of anti-Roma people hatred against the Romani people. However, now we can see also the growing tendency of hate against Muslims and against migrants from the third world countries, if I may use this term from European point of view. So we can see that the interconnection between this hate is really dangerous. I agree with you.
Carmen, what are your thoughts from your vantage point and from what you're seeing? I know we've spoken about the far right with you previously as well, but these sorts of reports just again solidify that viewpoint, and then one wonders politicians as well are becoming ever more far right. So this seems like a very depressing situation, right, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I mean, I am always optimist in the sense that it's true that the problem is there, the problem is growing, but at the same time, I think more people are becoming aware of this problem. And once you become aware, you can put a solution. Obviously, you need conjoining efforts. And this is the difficult part. So there are a lot of third parties who don't want to put an end to this problem. But it's true that the far right is an increasing global movement, is a global threat somehow, and their ideas and their rhetoric and their narratives are spreading really fast. And this Europe is one of the shows evidence of this trend.
Joana, and I know this issue I'm sure you've read about and have studied it possibly as well yourself too, is one of the issues that comes up a lot in why we have a rise of the far right is the feeling that the majority, the Judeo-Christian, nature of these societies is changing drastically, right? At least that's what's the perception. The reality is often very, very different. But who exactly do you think that narrative really benefits? Is it just the politicians who are riding on this wave of hate because they're distracting probably their populace from various economic issues, etc.?
I think that is actually one of the versions of the narrative. We cannot forget that the European Union itself is based under a Judeo-Christian matrix, and the European project itself. It has its scores on this matrix, but I think that the problem goes beyond this. So I think that these anxieties, these fears, have been dormant for long. It's not as if this is a new phenomenon. This has been inside the European structure for a long time, and now has come as a concern because of, for example, the extremist terrorist attacks perpetrated in European soil have been linked to the whole of the Muslim community, for example, what is a complete mistake. But for example, what is happening nowadays in France, and for example, with the new policies of President Macron, it's actually a way of tackling and reviving this Judeo matrix core that is supposedly at the base of the European Union. But antagonistically, we cannot forget that these pillars are also based in non-discrimination, tolerance, freedom of thought, justice, solidarity, and equality. So we have here a very, very delicate problem to tackle at a policy level for the years to come. We cannot forget either that Muslim minorities have been portrayed as non-belonging and wanting to separate themselves from the society. And this has directly and indirectly affected the way European policies are being shaped towards minorities, and especially targeting Muslim communities.
Miroslav, let's talk about solutions then. What needs to change for perceptions of each other within these societies to become better, right? Because at the core of this, we're talking not just about Muslims, but any minorities, right? So even about the Jews, for example, there needs to be more people-to-people contact. Is that something that you think is missing?
I think it's one of the possible solutions, because we can see the difference, for example, between the Western Europe and Eastern Europe. In East Central Europe or Eastern Europe, we can sometimes talk about Islamophobia without Muslims, because the people, they don't have daily contacts with Muslim neighborhoods, etc. On the other hand, in France or in many Western European countries, you can see this daily contacts, and that's something what can maybe improve the solution of the problem. On the other hand, I do not see the something what can be really quick solution. We can see step by step policy, or we should demand a step by step policy which can make this attitudes towards minorities better. However, in these days we can see also the polarization in European societies. You can see the growing tendency. Also, in some progressivist movements, they have better attitudes towards minorities, including Muslims. On the other hand, you can see the growing influence of far-right movements.
You know, Carmen, and I think we may have discussed this before, but as Miroslav there said, you know, one of the good points is that we, even in countries that have significant Muslim minorities, so for example, as he brought up France, in that country, the entire country, including the population, is moving on a very, if we're completely honest, Islamophobic path, right? So even with that people-to-people contact, it's not changing people's opinions to the better. Why is that, do you think? I mean, why isn't that people-to-people contact working in this case? And if that's not going to work, then what will?
Yes, I think it is a very complex phenomenon that should be tackled from many different perspectives, and different actors are involved. Definitely, as Miroslav has said, and you also mentioned, the daily contact between minorities and majorities obviously help. I'm living in Granada, and we live with a big Muslim community in Spain, and actually this helps. But also, don't forget the media, and don't forget social media platforms spreading a constant daily message of hate by certain parties, certain actors, with interest in the matter. That actually, especially in the situation that we are living now with these lockdowns where people are overwhelmed with a lot of information, a lot of fake news, misinformation. People are scared. People don't know. The future seems to be sometimes uncertain. Economic crisis is a threat, and it's almost a reality. So it's the perfect habitat for people. It's a perfect environment for people to believe and to find an easy scapegoat. So it's true that the daily contact and having minorities and majorities get in touch on a daily basis will obviously help. But we cannot forget also the responsibility of individual citizens in social media platforms with particular interest in mind, with a particular agenda, and also the media.
And that brings me very well now to the next point I wanted to talk about, in fact, and that is online. And, you know, these online platforms, Joana, social media platforms through Facebook, et cetera, WhatsApp, and even the dark web, right? All of the above put together really creates this atmosphere where you're allowed to express and troll to the extent that you want, right? And create and further radicalize people. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think presently this is the biggest danger of them all, and especially this has been heightened with the COVID pandemic that has put the political activity, the normal, ordinary political activity aside. And it has heightened and boosted social media platforms, and as you well said, others that happen in the darknet, such as Parler and also Telegram. I follow, for example, some trackers like Bellingcat that track far-right posts on Twitter and on Parler, and it is absolutely outraging the level of sympathy and hatred towards a minority, especially a Muslim community. Now, in times of COVID, we have all read about, for example, manipulated images of Muslims that allegedly were trying to break into mosques in Ramadan, that were manipulated, for example, by Tommy Robinson in England, and others that have been boosting and exacerbating the way we feel about Muslims. But I would just want to add regarding the previous question that education and civil society organizations must have a pivotal role to tackle disinformation and how we behave as individual citizens, and how we live with other minorities and with other communities. Without education, without basic education, without engaging with the communities, we will never reach all the pillars of human values and target Islamophobia.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to give Miroslav and Carmen the final word, a minute or so each, if you can. Miroslav, what's your opinion about online radicalization as well as the importance of education to fix the situation?
Online radicalization is a huge problem in various platforms. We can see also these global networks of very young far-right terrorists, if it was connected, for example, with groups like Atomwaffen Division or Feuerkrieg Division, and we can see the growing tendency to militancy. However, we don't have the data about the direct connection between this online radicalization and offline action. On the other hand, we can see some very brutal acts of violence which were connected with this online mobilization and radicalization. And of course, education is a very important element. On the other hand, we can see maybe the impact of education in long-term perspective. Actually, recently we are in a very difficult position due to this fact of radicalization in previous years, among other due to the impact of the so-called migration crisis.
You know, Carmen, just as an example of the online radicalization, right? Just recently in the UK, we had the youngest terrorist charged. He was 13 when he began when he was entrapped essentially by online radicalization as a neo-Nazi. Again, how important is that? And then is education then the way to go to ensure at least that the next generation is not being affected as badly?
Exactly. All the times, every time I have been here in this TV show, in your program, I told the same. Is that education as a lecturer, I always tell my students, and my students are adults, they are university students, but as future educators, I always tell them that the important thing is that we should raise a generation of critical thinkers so that they are able to discriminate the kind of information they are exposed to, what is radicalization, what is mainstream behavior, what they are expected to be as citizens, their responsibility. This is key. This is essential. But also, I think we should not place the whole amount of responsibility in this future generation. What to do now with the problems we have now is something we should tackle with all the different actors in society. So politicians have their quota of responsibility, civil society has their quota of responsibility, future educators, we have our quota of responsibility growing the next generation, but legislators will also be very aware and serious about the problems we have right now. We need to join efforts.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Carmen. I do apologize. The clock has gotten the best of us. We sincerely appreciate all three of you for taking your time out of your busy schedules to share your thoughts with us this Saturday. That was Carmen speaking to us from Granada, Miroslav speaking to us from Brno, and Joana was speaking to us today from Brussels. All of them sharing their expertise with us about this worrying, but not surprising, again, survey coming out of these three European advocacy group, Hope Not Hate, the Expo Foundation, as well as the Amadeus Stiftung, I believe it is the organization's name, also speaking again about the survey about how Europeans in these 8 countries view minorities. So they mention Muslims certainly, but it's not just limited to Muslims. There are a whole bunch of other minority groups that we probably should and must mention as they are in this report, including Jews and Roma, et cetera, et cetera. The view on all of the above is pretty dismal, if we're completely honest. I mean, 29% is the best percentage of views on Muslims, and that is coming out of the UK. And we know the UK has its own issues with Islamophobia and other forms of hatred as well. So what will Europe and what should Europe be doing to tackle this wave of hate, as well as far-right terrorism? And this has translated into real-world terrorism as well. The Halle Synagogue attacks, Anders Behring Breivik, just a few examples of what has happened in Europe, and potentially more and worse, potentially, and hopefully not, is on the horizon as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.